All right, as usual, I will open with prayer because I always think that's best. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together again tonight. Thank you, as usual, for the rain on a Wednesday. Thank you for our time together. Please bless our time together. Please help everyone to get home safely. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks, everybody, for coming back. Always appreciate people coming. So we're shifting gears a little bit tonight. Still a little bit of science to cover, and then the second half of tonight and the entire lecture next week is actually kind of a long one. Is going to be all dedicated to Noah's flood and various aspects of that. In brief review for anybody who missed last week and. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So last week was a really simple lecture, very basic stuff on radioisotope dating. Nothing complex at all. As you recall, we looked carefully at carbon-14 dating, recognizing not only the flaws, but how it actually can be used to support a young Earth. And then we looked at something that's been developed a little more recently, potassium-argon dating, and then the most recent thing, the isochron dating. And we talked about the many flaws and holes and unanswered questions left in this field. And as I've emphasized the last several weeks, radioisotope dating is a somewhat decent argument for an older Earth, but it must be weighed against everything else we've discussed, including all of the flaws that we talked about with the radioisotope dating. Before I move on, are there any leftover questions on radioisotope dating? I figured everybody got it. No problem. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, Nick is filming them for us, so I don't know all the details on that. He's still kind of putting those together for me, but they're not for purchase. Yes, sir. That's fair. I think that's fair. So, very good. Well, moving on from that. So last week we did talk about radioisotope dating. Tonight, for the first half, we're going to talk about paleontology and evaluate the fossil record. So let me give you an example. There's a book that I used to put together this course called The Young Earth, written by a guy named Dr. Morris, who unfortunately just recently passed away. Answers in Genesis had a nice tribute to him. But he gives a fantastic example of how dating is done by secularists. So his example is you are out in the field and you discover a fossil. And you want to know how old this fossil is. And you realize that the fossil is far too old to be dated using carbon-14 dating, something we talked about last week. After about 80,000 years, you really can't use carbon-14 dating. So, and the sediment in which the fossil was found really can't be used for dating either, as sediment, as we've talked about in the past, is new rock formed from an old source. So it really doesn't help us to know how old it is. So what do? Well, you consult a book of fossils, of course, and it tells you that, interestingly, the fossil you've discovered is actually called an index fossil, meaning that particular fossil is only found in a certain layer of rock. And that book tells you that that layer is 320 million years old. Now, interestingly, next to your fossil, you find a volcanic rock. And you take this in to be evaluated, and you have endless fun, so you can do all kinds of dating. And radioisotope dating gives it different dates for this volcanic rock that you found. Lead dating gives you 500 million years old. Potassium-argon gives you 100 million years old. And rubidium-strontium gives you 325 million years old. So, as we talked about last week, this is very common to get very different dates from different techniques. So how do you know which one is correct? Well, that's easy. Your rock was close to the fossil and in the same layer as that fossil that we know is 320 million years old. So the scientists tell you, we know that the rubidium-strontium dating is correct, and your rock's 325 million years old. Problem solved. Now, this whole scenario is called circular reasoning. This is the rocks dating the fossils and the fossils dating the rocks, but this is how it is done. So let's talk about the fossils. What is a fossil? Well, it refers to something that has been petrified. Petrified means turned into rock. It's either a petrified remains or petrified impression of a once living thing. And these pictures are obviously example of fossils. I think we all know what fossils are. But these can be bone or teeth. They can be an impression that's hardened or something preserved in amber, say Jurassic Park style. 95% of the fossils that we find are shallow marine organisms like shellfish. The vast majority of fossils look like these. Of the remaining 5%, 95% of those are algae and plants. And 95% of the remaining 0.25% are invertebrates, things like insects. The small remaining percentage of all fossils, the 0.0125%, are vertebrates, and most of those are fish. So 95% of land vertebrates that we find, so things like humans and mammals, etc., consist of a single bone. So when you hear about the fossil record, understand that the vast majority of fossils out there are marine life. And then from there, the vast majority of what's left over are plants or bugs or tiny little fish. A very small percentage are actually represented in the things that we all think of in fossils in terms of dinosaurs, human bones, mammals, etc. So how does a fossil form? Well, the first step is rapid burial. In order for this organism to be preserved, it must be buried very quickly to be protected from either being decomposed, scavenged, etc. And after that, the organism is then exposed to a combination of mud and mineral-rich water. And as this water dries, we talked about this before, when you have salt in a water, eventually it dries, minerals precipitate out, just like if you're holding a glass of salt water and you let it evaporate, you're left with salt behind. These minerals precipitate out, they fill the cell of the living organism, and they create this permanent, hard, rock-like structure from these minerals. And then the surrounding mud also hardens up, and now the fossil is buried in rock. So you've got this rock, inside is the actual fossil. And it's a similar idea when you get casts and mold fossils. This is basically the dead organism created a little cast, almost like a foot in wet concrete. And that's then filled with sediment that hardens into the shape of the organism. So you can preserve the organism itself, or you can preserve its essence in a shape, if you will. And then these fossils get covered with additional sediment or layers of rocks, which can then speed up fossilization. And more burial occurs, and eventually the earth shifts, and the plates move, and the rock layers raised up. And then subsequently those rock layers are eroded or dug, and we can find the fossil exposed. Now, obviously all these circumstances must be correct for fossilization to occur. Minus a major flooding event, it is a very rare event to be hospitalized, not so much, fossilized. So very, fortunately for my kids' college fund, it's not, just kidding. That sounds terrible. I'm just kidding. So it is a very rare event for fossilization to occur randomly on its own. Now, secularists will tell us that's how basically all the fossils are formed, are via a random event. They'll show you a picture of a deer who goes and lays next to a stream of water and suddenly dies next to the water, and there just so happens there's a big flood that day, the water covers the deer, protects it, a bunch of sediment is dumped on there, and fossilization occurs. Now obviously that is a very rare event to occur by random chance, but that's what secularists tell us happens with fossils. So they're very rare to happen on their own. In fact, so rare that if basically the estimate of how human fossils would form is about one bone, not one human, one bone out of a billion humans, one of our bones will be fossilized. Meaning if all Americans died today, we might form a quarter of a skeleton with our bones. So very rare I'm sorry, 1 bone in a billion, not 1 bone per human. 1 bone in a billion. So if all the Americans died, we might find a quarter of a skeleton. So obviously it's a very rare event, and so secularists tell us that this is a very rare, slow event, thus proving that the Earth is very, very old because it takes forever to form these fossils. And then they give us the geologic column, basically, to tell us more about the fossils. And I'm sure you all have seen something like this before that says you can basically date how old a fossil is based on how deep it is buried. And this is based on the assumption that sediments are laid down over millions of years. Remember, sediments are rock layers, basically. You've got sediment or debris that slowly lays down and then hardens. And this is coupled with the idea of evolution to come up with this geologic column. And again, the idea is that the older, more primitive fossils are at the very bottom because this was more the beginning of the Earth. And then as layers build up on top, we get more advanced creatures moving our way up. Again, the theory is that the fossils are formed randomly and by chance, and newer organisms lived on top of the previously dead and buried ones. Index fossils. I mentioned this at the beginning. An index fossil is a fossil that is unique to a certain layer and is therefore very useful for evolutionists in dating the surrounding fossils and rocks. So again, think back to that opening example where we found a fossil that was an index fossil. Right next to it we found a volcanic rock. We weren't sure how old the volcanic rock was, so we radioisotope dated. It gave wildly different numbers, but we knew only one was correct. Why? Because the fossil here was an index fossil. Circular reasoning. So, having said that, and this is what the secularists tell us, what does the fossil record really tell us? Here's the only thing we can know from the fossil record. The only thing we know for sure is that certain organisms were buried together. We have no guarantee that they lived together or that they died together. The only thing we know for sure is that they're buried together. Creationists agree the geologic table seems to be well established in terms of marine animals at the bottom and mammals at top, but we're going to talk about why that is. What's really in dispute between creationists and secularists is the time frame involved. How long did this take? The creationists will tell you they form very quickly, perhaps in a global flood. The latter will tell you that they happened very, very slowly over millions of years. So the first question to ask when we're going to look at a time frame is, can animals die and be buried quickly? The answer is obviously yes. Look very carefully at this fossil, and you'll see this is a fish eating a fish. That happens very quickly for those of you who haven't seen that before. This one's hard to distinguish. This is a baby coming out of its mom. This is a delivery in process. This animal was immediately fossilized. This is a jellyfish. I don't know if any of you have been stung by one. You've probably wanted to kick it if you ever had. Suffice it to say, when a jellyfish comes out of the ocean, I think we all know that it disintegrates very quickly, really cannot survive for very long outside of the ocean. So how do we get a fossil if things can't be dead and buried very, very quickly? And these fossil examples are fantastic evidence for that. Now the second question is, can you fossilize quickly? Well, sure, why not? Here's a fossilized miner's hat. This was found in Tasmania after being in water for 50 years. It was completely fossilized. Dr. Morris, who I mentioned at the beginning, who wrote the book The Young Earth, he has a sample in his collection that is pictured below here that came from a fence line that was known to be built in the 1800s, and then someone dug it up and found it again in the year 2000, and the buried portion was completely petrified or fossilized, proving that fossils can happen very, very quickly. They do not require millions of years. And so the third question is, are these strata, and by strata I mean layers of rocks, one layer on top of the next, are they as uniform as would be predicted by millions of years? Now, the geologic column that they show you here is very pretty. It's straight up and down. Every layer is there. But in real life, what we found is there's actually missing layers. There's things we don't see. So if you take globally across the Earth, sure, you can find that top layer, the next layer, the next layer, the next layer, but at individual places, we may find layers 1, 2, 5, 6, 7. And we can't, and so we have these missing layers that can be found regionally, but not globally. And the problem is we can't find evidence for erosion away of the missing layers, meaning they were never laid down in the first place. Does that make sense if millions of years we know this layer, this layer, this layer, this layer, and we have a missing layer here and there's no evidence of erosion? Well, why did that happen? It's because it wasn't done over millions of years. The missing layers are exactly what you would predict from a global catastrophic flood with massively different currents of water and wind directions, some sediments being deposited in one area, different sediments and its fossils being deposited elsewhere. Some would be stacked high, some would be spread out. That's exactly what you would predict from a global flood. So how then do creationists explain these layers? Excuse me. What we start with is there are actually layers below the fossil-containing strata. Again, strata just refers to rock layers. And these very, very bottom layers are essentially devoid of fossils. And these are very likely the pre-flood layers. Now, as I told you at the very beginning, fossils can be formed outside of a global catastrophic flood. The deer falls asleep next to the stream, dies there, a fossil is formed. It just happens to be a rare event. So in these very low layers that are pre-flood, yes, we find fossils, but they're extremely rare, which is exactly what you would predict if this was happening very slowly. And then the fossil layer containing layers, the layers we see above that have all the fossils, have a massive amount of fossils, and those were laid down during the flood. And then we actually do find a few post-flood fossils formed due to local catastrophes, flood, etc. Again, these are rare events. And so, in other words, most, but not all, fossils were formed during the flood. So the very bottom layer has a small amount. The layers that we think came during the flood have a massive amount, which makes sense, and the very top layers that came after the flood have a very small amount. So comparing the pre- and post-flood environments, how do creationists look at this? Well, the pre-flood and post-flood world were likely very different environments, and likely many distinct organisms in the fossil record are those that actually couldn't survive a post-flood world. So those unique things we find that are now extinct probably are extinct because they had a more difficult time surviving in a post-flood world. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll talk about some of the differences in the worlds that probably were pre-flood and post-flood. But one theory is that the pre-flood world had zones of life, if you will, certain areas where certain animals lived, and those were very likely buried together. So, for example, marine animals would live at lower elevation and warmer climates, while higher elevation had cooler climates, and usually that's where the mammals are. Lower elevation also had something called gymnosperm vegetation. These are naked seed plants, and this is what we find fossilized with the dinosaurs. The higher elevations had something called angiosperm vegetation. These are the flowering plants. And this is what we find fossilized with the mammals. And this is probably why we don't see man fossilized next to the dinosaurs. They were living in a different environment as the flood came along. Looking again, what I'm trying to show you here is how do the creationists explain the various strata levels? And this is a complex topic called hydrodynamic selectivity. Basically, what it comes down to is water is very, very good at sorting sizes and shapes. Every object has something called the specific gravity. And the specific gravity of an object tells you how well it floats or sinks in certain fluids. So we actually have tables that we know that this thing will float in this substance but not in this substance, etc., etc. And so the specific gravity, if you will, of shells, mollusks, trilobites, etc., is higher, it's heavier, it's denser than human bones. So those things will sink lower than human bones. Simpler, more uniform structures like round shapes, like a little pebble or a quarter, will sink faster than more complex shapes like a human. These various sinking rates can help us explain what we find in each layer of rock strata. Now, this is obviously dependent on multiple local factors as well, so we would expect to find some heterogeneity, meaning some mixing. But suffice it to say that when you think of it this way, you drop 10 different objects in water, you know they're going to sink at different rates. You know certain ones are going to float better than others. This is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the flood and the formation of the geologic columns. Now, what about the nature of animals themselves? Well, the flood started in the ocean and worked its way up. That makes sense. When water always is going to go to the lowest point, so it had to start from the lowest point and work its way up. Well, the first creatures to be captured would obviously be the ocean-dwelling shellfish and coral that live on the bottom and are swept up to the land and sedimented out early. Next would be the fish that would be caught and up. And this would be followed by less adaptable or slow-moving animals that can't get to higher ground. I don't know, say the dinosaurs. Last to be swept up in the flood would be man and birds. Why? We can climb. Birds can fly. You see a lot of water coming, what are you going to do? You're going to climb to the highest thing possible, and you're going to hold on to any debris you possibly can before you're finally overtaken. These would be the highest levels of sediment, and that is exactly what we observe. So let's look at that column again, and let's talk about it. Organisms would be laid down top to bottom, not by how evolved they are, but by certain principles. More mobility, you're going to be up there higher. Decreased density, you're going to be up there higher. Very dense at the bottom, not as dense at the top. Shellfish are heavier than bones. And then with that hydrodynamic selectivity, the specific gravity is going to lead to where things come out in that layer. And so again, this is why you have your fish in the middle, your mammals at the top. So what makes more sense? That, the above scenario with a catastrophic flood, or millions of years filled with occasional random fossilization? And I hope the answer is fairly obvious. Finally, I want to talk about something called living fossils. Living fossils are organisms that are found both in the fossil record and alive today with essentially no change. Examples include this ginkgo tree and our favorite friend, the cockroach. The ginkgo tree, we're told, came out 252 million years ago, and the cockroach 49 million years ago, and the amazing cockroach is so well adapted and evolved that it hasn't had to change in 49 million years. Well, there actually are at least 3,000 examples of living fossils, and most date to the Cenozoic period, which for creationist perspective is post-flood, which makes a lot of sense. The animals that survived the flood and could live in the new environment are what we see as living fossils. Their existence actually makes a pretty good argument against evolution. Why in the heck are they still here? Why have these things not needed to evolve or change? The distribution of the living fossils is also pretty good evidence for a flood and a changing environment afterwards. Remember, we talked about many fossils that are extinct that we don't see today. We don't see many of the living fossils that were at the lower layers because they couldn't survive in a post-flood world. But post-flood, these creatures, or kinds, and we're going to talk a lot about kinds next week, diversified fairly quickly. In summary, the fossils really are not an argument for either the old Earth or evolution. In fact, the existence of fossils represents pretty good evidence for a global flood. And the geologic column that we always hear so much about that tells us how old things are actually extremely well explained by the account of Genesis, and I would argue better explained by the account of Genesis. So before I move on from this simple topic, are there any questions on paleontology? Yes, sir. Why didn't Noah kill the cockroaches? That's a great question. I would actually, I'll trade the cockroaches for the mosquitoes. I wish he had gotten rid of the mosquitoes. So, very good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I honestly, this was a geologic column picture I just took from the internet, so I don't know how accurate it is. So this may be somebody else's. I did not take this from an official secularist book. Yeah, I mean, good question. There would be various factors in there. What they're actually showing there, if you look really carefully at the writing, which you probably can't see, is giant insects. That's not really a dragonfly. Those are probably extinct insects of some sort. So the theory would be that there's more than just hydrodynamic selectivity, obviously. There's also environments. These would have been animals that probably existed at that lower, warmer elevation than they would have been at the higher elevation. Perhaps they can't survive at the higher elevation, that type of thing. Good. All right, guys. So, oh, yes. Yeah, of course. I don't. I guess I. Sorry, I don't follow. How do they? What do they do with petrified wood in terms of? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yes, petrified wood is probably easier to find than a fossil is. The process is still the same. I mean, you still have petrification or turning a living thing into a rock. So I think that's the point there, is this is just on the plant side as opposed to being on the animal side. I don't think they use wood per se in the geologic column, if you will. Good. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question is, I learned to have to repeat the questions for the video. So the question is on commenting on Mount St. Helens and how the tree's petrified. Yeah, we've talked about that briefly, that actually the evidence from Mount St. Helens is pretty impressive, that you're exactly right. Not only did the trees petrify, but actually we almost got sort of pre-coal formations from a lot of the trees that are there. So the trees themselves that are there have turned into a peat structure. Peat is kind of the precursor to coal. The theory is that if there's another eruption, we actually will turn that peat into coal, and those things happen very rapidly. So, as I've talked about many times, Mount St. Helens is a fascinating creationist study of proofs of a lot of the things that we have discussed, and there are some great videos on Mount St. Helens out there for that. All right. Well, moving along. Now I want to turn to Noah's flood, and we're going to spend the next week and a half talking about some of the specifics of Noah's flood, because it is so important to what we see in the earth today, and so important to understand what the flood was. So again, as I've clearly outlined here, it's fundamental to everything I have discussed is whether or not there was a global flood. I will say this multiple times over the next couple weeks. You either have millions of years and very little water, or thousands of years and massive amounts of water to explain the fossil record. So you see here, this is the secularist view, how many millions of years things were built up. This is the creationist view, things came along very quickly from the flood. So, secular geology tells us rock layers were laid down slowly over millions of years. Again, as I've emphasized many times, keep in mind that millions of years is absolutely critical to evolution. If the Earth is not millions of years old, there is no evolution. The only argument the evolutionists ever have is, Ross, it took a lot of time, and you just don't know how long a million years is. So I would argue, as we talked about at the beginning here, I don't care how many millions or billions of years you had, evolution didn't happen. But if you can undermine the millions of years argument, there is no point in even discussing evolution. So this is why they are so adamant about the millions of years. They also tell us that fossils are rare events that happen spontaneously over the history of the Earth. Biblical history tells us that there was a basic rock layer laid down at creation, followed by most rock layers being laid down during the flood, and a small layer at the top that has occurred in the last 4,000 years or so since the flood. Biblical history tells us the vast majority of the fossils formed during the flood. Now, whether or not there was a global flood is absolutely critical to the creation-evolution argument, which is why I want to spend so much time on the flood. Again, the pre- and post-flood worlds were likely very different. Many animals and their habitats that existed in a pre-flood world couldn't survive in a post-flood world. And again, that's probably why we find so many extinct species in the fossil layers. Theories about Pangea. Are you all familiar with Pangea? Have we heard of Pangea? So Pangea is the theory that we were originally one continent. The Earth was one single continent that eventually broke up. And it's a pretty decent theory for even a kindergartner. If you just cut the continents and try to fit them together, you can picture South America fitting very well into Africa, and you actually can draw the continents together pretty well. Actually, the island of Madagascar, you can see where it would fit into Africa, things like that. So theories about this Pangea actually fit very well into a global flood event, and we will talk about that. As I discussed last week, the theory from the RATE team is that possibly the flood was so catastrophic it may have actually changed nuclear decay rates for a period of time. The rising of the mountains, the carving of the canyons, these are all extremely well explained by the flood. And again, the idea of a global flood is so devastating to uniformitarianism and millions of years that this is why secularists are so anxious to dismiss it. Remember, the other thing secularists need is uniformitarianism. The present is key to the past. Everything we see today, the rates at which they occur, are what they've been for millions of years. You destroy that uniformitarianism, you destroy their argument. Number one, Noah's Ark was not a myth. It is critical to avoid the trap of treating the flood as myth or allegory. It's not a children's book. And I've probably been guilty of this. All of us as parents have been guilty of this, of showing cute little kids' pictures of Noah's Ark, and aren't the animals so cute and sweet and rescued on there? But it is not a children's book. It was a global, catastrophic, life-ending event. And the understanding to that is key to understanding the earth we see today. So it's very important that we don't emphasize that Noah's Ark is a cute story. So let's look at the flood. I suspect, obviously, as good Christians, that most of you are familiar with the basic outline, but I actually want to review the account because it is going to become very important for several of the things that I discuss going forward. And I actually would encourage all of you to pick up your Bible and read Genesis 6 through 8 again over the next week or two, as it is a fascinating account. But the world had become wicked. Every inclination of the thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. God decided he would destroy his entire creation 120 years from that point. We'll come back to that. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. God provided Noah very specific instructions on the construction of the ark. It was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, and it was to have upper, middle, and lower decks. Noah was to bring his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives onto the ark for a total of 8 people. 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mates, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. I wonder what word I want to emphasize. Were also brought by God onto the ark. I underline kinds many times here. We're going to talk about why next week, so you have to come back for that. But kind is very, very important. On the 17th day of the 2nd month of Noah's 600 years, all the springs of the great deep, also next week, burst forth, and the floodgates of heaven, next week, were opened. And the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains were covered. to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left, and those with him on the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. At the end of 115 days, on the 17th day of the seventh month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The water slowly receded until the first day of the 10th month, when the tops of the mountains became visible. Noah then sent out a raven, which could not land, a dove, which also returned, and then another dove that came back with an olive leaf, proving the earth was in fact dry. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. By the 22nd day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. God then told Noah and his sons to, quote, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. He also told Noah that everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. Next time somebody tells you about vegetarianism. Just kidding. But this is where in the Bible we don't know for sure whether people were vegetarian prior to the flood or not, but certainly the end of vegetarianism happened after the flood. God then established his covenant with Noah that, quote, never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. The covenant was confirmed with the rainbow. Key points. This is a very detailed account of an actual event. This is not a myth. There is a clear explanation of why the flood occurred, how it occurred, how Noah was rescued, and how life was to be repopulated. This was unquestionably a massive amount of water which would reshape the earth and was something the earth had never seen and would never see again. Once again, this is God's word and account of what he did, not an allegory. We'll explore more details of this and the supporting evidence over this and next week's session, obviously. But I want you to understand it is important that this is historical fact. But was it just a local flood? So one popular compromise theory, and we're going to talk more about compromise theories at the very end of all these talks, but one compromise theory is that the flood occurred locally, and it was in and around Mesopotamia only, where Noah and most population was, and it wasn't actually a global event. And this theory was developed because a global flood would clearly wipe out the millions and billions of years we find in secular geology. And it would wipe out the fossil record. So secular geologists tell us, well, the flood didn't happen, it was just a global event. So what's wrong with this? Well, we're modifying God's word to fit man's quote-unquote science. Let's talk about the biblical problems with a local flood and this compromise. Genesis 6:7, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and of the creatures that move along the ground. 6:13, I'm going to put an end to all people. I'm going to destroy both them and the earth. 7:22, everything on dry land that had breath in its nostrils died. 7:23, every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Much like the creation account, where God says there was morning, there was evening, the first day, and emphasizes it over and over, in the same account, God repeats himself just to make it clear in case anybody was wondering or wanted to challenge it. Further biblical problems. God tells us in Genesis 9:11 that never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Well, floods happen all the time. We see local floods all the time, and this would obviously make God's promise invalid. The most important problem, though, is Genesis 7:20. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits. Remember that water will move to the lowest possible place. This flood was clearly global. This is not what happened. Okay. We do not have the flood stopping here. Yeah, that's right. Well, there is that. So, let's look at some other flood legends around the world. If we all came from the same 8 people, why doesn't everyone have a flood story? Seems like a catastrophic event like the flood should be remembered by cultures other than just the Hebrews, the Israelites. Well, in fact, there are. There are over 300 flood legends recorded in various cultures. And as expected with legends passed down without divine inspiration, there are some differences, but some similarities are actually pretty striking. So let's look at the Hawaiian legend. Long after the death of the first man, the world became wicked, and only one good man was left, Nu'u. He made a great canoe with a house filled on it, and filled it with animals. Waters covered the earth, and only Nu'u and his family survived. What about the Aztec legend? Tapi, who lived a long time ago, was a pious man. The Creator told Tapi to build a boat and then take his wife and pairs of every animal onto the boat. Everyone thought he was crazy, but the flood did in fact come. Men and animals tried to climb the mountains to get away, but they became flooded. When the rain ended, Tapi knew the land had dried up when he released a dove that did not return. How about the Tanzania legend? Rivers began to flood. The god told 2 men to get in a ship. They were told to take a lot of seed and a lot of animals. The flood covered the mountain and eventually stopped. To see if the flood waters had receded, a dove was released but came back. Subsequently, a hawk was released that did not return. The men left the boat and took the animals and the seed with them. What is the importance of these multiple legends? Well, again, there's over 300 of these, multiple cultures having it, including cultures from desert and mountainous regions, people that aren't used to seeing water, yet they all have a flood legend. Now, this makes sense if all cultures came from Noah and then were separated at the Tower of Babel, but retained the basic summary of their origins. What about the Epic of Gilgamesh? Have any of you heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? Okay, so this comes up a lot. This is an epic from ancient Mesopotamia. It tells the story of a guy named Gilgamesh who's king of Uruk. And this guy Gilgamesh is on a quest for eternal life. This excuse me. This is recorded on, I believe, 12 different tablets. But tablets 10 and 11 telling the story of Gilgamesh is important to the flood story. Now, what happens in tablets 10 and 11 is that they tell the story of somebody named Utnapishtim. I don't know if I can say that over and over and over again. I had to be very careful with how I said that. Who's a hero that Gilgamesh is seeking out on his quest. Well, why is Gilgamesh seeking out this person? Well, Utnapishtim is actually the Noah-like figure in this story. So the god named Enlil decides he's going to destroy humans because they've become, what? Too noisy. Sounds like a parent. The god Enki, however, warns Utnapishtim and gives him plans for a boat. Utnapishtim builds the boat, gathers all the animals over the course of a week, over 7 days. The flood then lasts 7 days. Meanwhile, the lower gods panic, and they leave their lower heavens for fear their homes will be destroyed by this flood. The boat eventually lands on Mount Nimish, and Utnapishtim releases a dove that returns and a raven that does not, and eventually he leaves the boat. Utnapishtim then offers sacrifices to the gods. The gods are thrilled because actually they've been starving without man to offer them sacrifices, and they realize they needed mankind. So they reward Utnapishtim with eternal life, which is presumably now why Gilgamesh, who is the Ponce de Leon of his day, is seeking him out. He wants to find eternal life. So did Moses steal the flood story from the Gilgamesh epic? This above flood legend, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the only flood legend that predates the writing of Genesis. The tablets for this epic are written about 200 years before Moses' birth. And there actually is an even earlier version of the flood story recorded elsewhere. So secularists will tell us, well, look, they were first. The Genesis account is simply one of those flood stories taken in part from the original Mesopotamian tale. However, a better theory is that Mesopotamian tale tracks well with the known flood story because they were descendants of Noah too. but it took creative license and polytheism and corrupted the original account. Well, why do I say that? Well, let's look at the differences in Gilgamesh and Genesis. First of all, the Gilgamesh epic is written as poetry. It's meant to be easily remembered and recited, rather than taken as literal history. The Gilgamesh epic gives very unrealistic time frames, 7 days to build an entire ark. Remember, the Genesis account tells us God told Noah 120 years in advance what was coming. Here we got a week. Then there were 7 days of rain. Then the dimensions described in the boat was actually a cube. You ever put a cube in water? Straight to the bottom. The Gilgamesh epic actually has man as the hero and gods as the dupes. Remember, they didn't realize they needed man's sacrifices. They regretted destroying the earth on a whim. They needed man to supply them food, etc. Contrast this with Genesis, which is a detailed historical account that carefully describes realistic time frames, both for the building and the flood, realistic dimensions, more on that later, and a judging but ultimately merciful God who rescues Noah and subsequently mankind. In conclusion, the Gilgamesh epic is ultimately that. It's an epic. It's a story. And while it may contain some elements of truth, as most epics do, it's clearly intended as a story and not a record of fact. Moses almost certainly would have been aware of the story when he was writing Genesis. His account isn't a copy of that story, but rather a refutation of the many pagan and polytheistic ideas that have been inserted into the story. Moses' version stands up incredibly well when we look into the facts. More on that next week. While the Gilgamesh story is simply a fairy tale. So, was Noah really 600 years old? Picturing a 500-year-old man building a huge boat that he enters at age 600 is a bit hard to contemplate in the modern era. However, most patriarchs prior to the flood lived an average actually of 912 years, according to the biblical record. These are some really old men. But interestingly, the age of the men starts to decline fairly rapidly after the flood. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. Arphaxad 438, Shelah 433, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abram. Look at the ages, and you see that actually these old ages start to decline very quickly as we go generations post-flood, to where Abraham was but a kid when he died at 175 years. So what happened? Well, obviously we don't know for sure, but there are actually some very good theories out there. One is that the pre-flood world was completely different than the post-flood world. The pre-flood world was likely a tropical environment, and shortly after the flood we got an ice age, which we'll talk about later, with about 30% of the world covered in ice. More importantly, if you recall the lectures on genetics and the concept of genetic entropy, which is that God created us with an incredible gene pool that has degenerated over time, this may actually carry a very good explanation. So again, God originally created man to live forever, but after the fall our genes started to decay. And increasing genetic bottlenecks. What's a genetic bottleneck? It's when you have interbreeding, close breeding, as what would have happened after Noah, and in part after the Tower of Babel, as you separated various cultures. You got a lot of interbreeding with very similar genetic kinds, where the same mutations could have been passed down, further corrupting the genetic code, leading to more death and shorter lives. Modern human DNA, and I didn't go over this in the genetics section, but the modern human genome can only replicate itself about 50 times due to something called telomeres. Telomeres are at the very ends of your DNA. And what happens is, as the DNA is copied, the protein that copies DNA cannot reach the very end of your DNA. So you actually lose a little bit of DNA every time it's copied. Well, these telomeres are the very ends of DNA that don't contain any useful genetic information. So they can get chopped off, kind of like the tail of a worm, if you will, until you get to the useful DNA. Well, eventually you run out of telomeres, and you can only do that about 50 times. Honestly, but for modern medicine, we might actually continue to be declining with shorter and shorter lives. So what do we see in the secular literature? Well, let's look at an extra biblical document that records the kings of Sumer. It bears a striking resemblance to the Genesis account in that it records 8 patriarchs. It actually excludes the equivalent of Adam and Noah, but it also records a flood and declining ages of the patriarchs as time goes on. Now the list gets a little silly. They assign much longer ages to their pre-flood kings, about 30,000 years, but it still does make the point. Now, it's not nearly as complete, detailed, or accurate, obviously, as the Genesis account, but it does provide important evidence for the idea of long-lived patriarchs. But what about an ark at that elevation? Wouldn't Noah need oxygen tanks? So, this is Mount Everest. We all know that to get there would require an incredible amount of oxygen, that when people climb Mount Everest, they need to train for it. So how, and we know that the ark floated on top of the water and it covered the highest mountains. So how in the world did Noah and his family breathe that high? Well, you can't look at today's world and assume the ark was 29,000 feet high, the height of Mount Everest. The flood actually would have initially worked with and created a much more leveled out world. If we actually did that with today's Earth, if we leveled everything out, we brought the oceans up, we brought the mountains down, what would happen? Water would actually cover everything to a depth of almost 1.7 miles, or 8,000 feet. And that 8,000 feet, for anybody who's been to Colorado, is a height that humans can easily live at without oxygen. Around day 150 in the flood, the mountains would have started to rise and the valleys starting to descend as the tectonic plates, which carry the earth, carry the crust of the earth, would shift and start to build the mountains. And Psalm 104 speaks well to this. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. So we cannot look at the modern world and assume the ark was floating that high. It wouldn't be that high. They would not need oxygen. So, conclusions on the flood. There was a literal global flood, and it destroyed all of creation except for what was on the ark. The flood is incredibly well documented in Genesis, but also documented in numerous extra-biblical sources. The flood well explains much of what we see today in the earth in terms of the fossil record, geology, and maybe even physics. Compromising on the details of the flood to fit quote-unquote modern science into the Bible carries all the same problems we've discussed in terms of evolution and the age of the earth. So, next week, what do I want to talk about? Next week I want to get more detailed into the specifics of the ark and the flood itself. So I want to talk about the ark construction. How could Noah do it? How long did it take? Was the vessel he built seaworthy? How do you get the animals on the ark? How do they survive the ark? And then where do they go once they get off? What are the logistics of that? We're going to talk at length about the importance of kinds in terms of repopulating the earth. I want to talk about the sources of water, how the water receded. And then I want to review some of the evidences that we see in Earth today that suggest that Noah's flood was a legitimate event. So, pause there. That I figure that's pretty fitting. Would have been better for last week, actually. So that, as usual, is my email address, rpacini1@yahoo. So if you have questions you want to email, you're welcome to do that. Questions I can answer now for anybody. Mm-hmm. That is a good point. That's true too. The point he's making is that even if you're 29,000 feet, you're still basically at sea level, and that is true. And there would be a difference in that in terms of oxygen concentration just from the sea level being there. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Mhm. So I have not put together my last talk, but I have two different sections on what happened to the dinosaurs that we're going to put together, and so yeah, we will eventually kind of cover what happened to the dinosaurs. That's in my miscellaneous FAQs at the end. So good. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yes. So the question was, is there a difference in terms of Pangea between secularists and creationists on how and when? Yes, there definitely is a difference. I cannot recall the exact time frame that the secularists tell us this happened, but I think both sides agree that there probably was a Pangea. The creationists obviously explain it through the flood, that things separated that way. The secularists, I'm sure, would tell you that it is a much slower event that occurred over a long period of time. I haven't looked into the details of what they claim on that, but yeah, I think both sides agree that Pangea probably is a reasonable theory. Perfect. What's that? Oh yeah, no, that's okay. I can deal with quiet. I can just keep talking. So, all right. Well, if nobody else has any other questions, we're done on time tonight. So, good. So if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. Feel free to come up and chat with me. That's totally fine. I hope to see y'all next week, and I'll see you then.